City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar
Hello, I'm Sandra Gilman, Chairman of the American Theater Wing. On behalf of our board and our president, Doug Leeds, we welcome you to our Working in the Theater seminars. We're being broadcast by CUNY TV from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. The Wing is best known as the creator of the Tony Awards that honor excellence on Broadway. But in addition, we provide annual grants to New York-based theaters and scholarships to theater students. We also broadcast a weekly interview program with theater personalities called Downstage Center with XM Satellite Radio. All our educational programs are free on demand at our website, americantheaterwing.org. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the Annenberg Foundation for their very generous support of these programs. Today, we'll look at the art of puppetry as it is increasingly used on theater stages, combining puppets and humans and creating new approaches to this ageless art form. I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator of today's seminar, the Executive Director of the American Theater Wing, Howard Sherman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. As somebody who has worked my entire career in what I can only refer to today as human theater, I am endlessly fascinated by the opportunities, the artistry, and the achievements that can be done with puppets and puppet theater. As someone who is of the age in which my knowledge of puppetry is almost wholly defined by Sesame Street and the Muppet Show, the continual revelations that I find in the world of puppetry are incredibly fascinating, and indeed, we're continuing to see the worlds of human theater and puppet theater merge and join forms in a variety of different ways. So today's panel will hopefully illuminate some of what I'm finding so fascinating, and I believe everybody else will. So let me first introduce our panelists. Beginning on my right, Basil Twist is the creator of Symphonie Fantastique, which toured internationally and is currently playing off-Broadway at Dodger Stages. He developed the puppetry for Paula Vogel's The Long Christmas Ride Home and is director of the Dream Music Puppetry Program at Here Arts Center. Pam Arciero is artistic director of the O'Neill Puppetry Conference in Waterford, Connecticut, where she directed the Emerging Artists Program for 5 years. She's a principal puppeteer on Sesame Street and has worked on numerous children's programs, including Between the Lions and Eureka's Castle. Roman Paska has directed original adaptations of works by Yeats, Strindberg, and Lorca, and his most recent work, Dead Puppet Talk, was seen at the Kitchen in September. He will direct Souls of Naples for Theater for a New Audience this spring, and from 1999 to 2002, he was director of the International Puppet Theater Institute in France. Cheryl Henson is the president of the Jim Henson Foundation and on the board of directors of the Jim Henson Company. Cheryl executive produced the award-winning and highly influential Henson International Festival of Puppet Theater from 1992 to 2000, and she continues to lead the foundation's grant-making programs to support contemporary puppetry. Rick Lyon has played a pivotal role in the development of the Broadway musical Avenue Q since its earliest workshops as both puppet designer and performer. His TV, film, and theater credits include Sesame Street, Men in Black, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films. And he writes scripts, music, and songs for his own company, the Lyon Puppets. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Before we start our discussion, I was very struck by some words I heard recently and want to share with you all a bit of tape on the topic of puppets and puppet theater, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Bill Irwin.
Puppet talk has become increasingly riddled with anxiety. The very expressions puppet and puppet theater suggest a heterogeneous range of phenomena that continue to increase and multiply with virtually no consensus as to what exactly this slippery thing we call a puppet is. It is clearer now what we mean when we say man than what we mean when we say puppet. And the concept of man has troubled great minds for centuries. There is, after all, something profoundly disturbing about a thing that persists in eluding precise definition. It could, of course, be argued that with no consensus on definitions, we lack the methodology for describing or discussing this phenomenon. But even if we don't know what a puppet is, we know that there are these things we call puppets.
As you might have guessed, that is not Bill Irwin just sitting around expounding on puppetry. That's actually an excerpt from Roman's piece, Dead Puppet Talk, which I mentioned played at the Kitchen last month. But as I watched that piece, it encapsulated all of the things that I was starting to think about for this panel. So what I'd like to just start off with is to ask everyone on the panel, what do you see as the profound difference between human theater and puppet theater? Have I already made an assumption that there is a profound difference, or where do those worlds merge? And Roman, since we started with a clip from your show, I'll start with you.
Well, when you say human theater and puppet theater versus puppet theater, it suggests that puppet theater is in human theater, and I think that that's maybe a good place to start. It's also one of the puppeteers are very insistent about the fact that there is, in fact, a human being behind most puppets, and it's really an art form that does always involve human intervention, and particularly in the theater. And I think that to talk about the differences, one should also talk about the similarities, not the similarities, but the way in which puppet theater is theater, and not really and not something else, and certainly not something in competition with the notion of a human theater.
Basil? Now, interestingly, we're talking about, I set it up as humans and puppets, and of course you've got this remarkable show, Symphonie Fantastique, which doesn't attempt to even represent a human or animal form. It's all shapes and motion. How does that play into the human versus puppet discussion that I set up?
Well, I mean, I think, as Roman pointed out, it's part of the excitement of a theatrical experience like Symphonie Fantastique or any puppetry performance is that it is live. There are performers backstage. Even in my show, you can't see them, but they're there. It's happening live. And I guess a little in response to what Professor Irwin said, I think in my show, because I'm trying to use puppets that are not our standard definition of puppets, in that they don't look necessarily like humans, but what's happening on stage, there is an act of bringing something to life. Some sort of inanimate material is brought to life, so to speak, on stage, and that's what makes it a puppet show.
Is there something about the interaction of the live human figure with the puppet figure that creates particular opportunities. Obviously, Avenue Q has that going on in a way that on Broadway we've not seen. And to what you were both saying in response to my narrow puppetist question, because it's almost, what is done in terms of, do you as a performer, Rick, who is visible the entire time you perform in Avenue Q, are you trying to be seen? Is it because of the particular puppet style that's been chosen? How do you relate, or are you meant to recede? Obviously, there's a human behind the puppet. He's the guy who's got his arm in it. How does that play into your performance? Are you trying to recede, or are you trying to be present along with the puppet?
Oh, I think it's absolutely necessary for the puppeteer to be present, especially in the style of puppetry that we're using in Avenue Q. It's a tandem performance. The puppet is part of the character, and the human being is also part of the character. Each aspect of that performance informs the other. The humans being on stage with the puppet, the puppet doesn't have movable features except for the mouth. Its eyebrows don't go up and down. It doesn't have eyes that blink or anything like that. It cannot express emotion in a way that we have codified, expressing emotion with a human face. So the performer being on stage with the puppet can do all those things, and it sort of informs the puppet's performance. And at the same time, the puppet is the character, so informs what the human being is doing on stage. So it's really a very symbiotic relationship. One doesn't succeed without the other. I think there are degrees of being present on stage that everybody is at slightly different places in Avenue Q, and that's perfectly valid too. I, as a performer, am very aware that people aren't paying their money to see me. They want to see the puppet. So I tend to focus more of the attention of the performance on the puppet. That's just my sort of personal philosophy about that. I know other puppeteers in the cast feel more, present themselves. So it's a balance, but one does not exist without the other. And I just want to hasten to say, we were talking about, puppet theater versus human theater. Avenue Q is not puppet theater. It is a musical that uses puppetry in the telling of its story, and it's a stylistic choice. It is not puppet theater. It is not conceived as a piece of puppet theater. It is a musical theater piece for Broadway that uses, like The Lion King, uses puppetry in the telling of the story.
Yeah. I just wanted to interject also that this whole relationship, the visible relationship between the puppeteer and the puppet, is a relatively new thing. And that it's something that people in the puppet world and puppeteers have been fascinated by for years, but has been behind the scenes. And that it used to always be with Sesame Street characters, with Muppet characters, that you would never show the puppeteer. It was very important that the audience, particularly a kid audience, not be given that opportunity to be confused, that the puppet is what's alive. But also certainly with Punch and Judy shows going way back, that the puppeteers are back. Even in Bunraku, the puppeteers wear hoods. It's a relatively new phenomenon to show the puppeteers. And I think that some of it might come from the puppeteers' fascination with being able to watch the performers perform the puppets. And that we just loved being able to watch Frank Oz and Jim Henson performing their characters. And there is something really fascinating about that relationship that now seems to have come to the stage.
Well, and it's a continuation of a sort of a general trend in modern theater, the sort of deconstruction.
Yeah.
We're laying bare the technology of the show. I mean, this goes back, many years in terms of you think of early Brecht performances where, they had the lights so that you could see where they were on stage. And you saw pieces of backstage scenery and stuff like that. It's sort of a continuation of that. It's not new. One of the things about Avenue Q that makes it new is that it's a style of puppet, as Cheryl indicated, that we have not seen performed that way live on stage before. And one of the gratifying things about Avenue Q for me is we're taking a style of puppet that has become sort of irrevocably linked with children's entertainment, and we're giving it back to an adult theater audiences. And for me, that's one of the exciting things about it.
Can I just do
of course.
one more? Just that I think that it's interesting when you talk about really exposing how something's done, that I feel that in some way this move towards low-tech puppetry and really showing how it's all done, also like the bread and puppet style theater just made out of paper mache, puppets that are very low-tech, is in some ways a reaction to all of the brilliant high-tech puppetry and animation computer-generated things that are available on television and film, and that a lot of people want to embrace it. And what's sort of magical about live puppet theater, seeing something come to life on stage right in front of you in a way that you just feel that it's coming to life, but you know perfectly well that the puppeteer is right there. It's not trying to fool you.
Much more organic. I think that's one of the interesting things about that Avenue Q has brought, is that organic feeling, you know, that you see the puppeteer, you see the physical movement that's creating that, and it's no longer the big super special effects. This is actually how it's done. And also, I think one of the things that's been happening is very judicious use of revealing the puppeteer and revealing the puppet. I know in Moby Dick, for example, your puppeteer often becomes the character, fades away, does the puppet, then once again returns as a different character. That all enhances our storytelling, which ultimately, to me, what we do with theater, whether it be puppet or human, is we are trying to tell a good story. We are trying to get across the ideas that are inherent in all of us that we want to share. And you know, sometimes this puppet theater versus human theater thing gets going pretty big, and I don't think there is a difference. I think we're all doing theater. It's just our form that we choose very often is a puppet, is an inanimate object, and how do we make that object live and breathe? And whether we show the puppeteers or not, the important thing is that that object is communicating to the audience our ideas and what we want to get across.
So with that, let me say that it seems that America, compared to most of the world, has pigeonholed puppetry. It's not as broadly thought of as the other forms of expressing narrative. And it has been pigeonholed into being thought of as mostly for children. Roman, you were involved in the Institute in France. Basil, you study as well at a different organization in France. And Cheryl, you have this great overview of puppetry both in the U.S. and internationally. What do you think has contributed to puppetry not having the same foothold in America that it has in so much of the world, the Asian countries, the European countries?
Well, I would disagree that it doesn't have the same foothold. There is more. I just, as someone who's just spent 4 years living in Europe, it is true that there is more puppet theater in Europe than there is per capita or whatever than there is in the United States. But that doesn't mean that it's more interesting or more experimental or whatever, or that the audiences are necessarily more attuned. Puppet theater. Any of our preconceptions about puppet theater here are inherited from the European or Eurocentric situation, and it is true that in Asian countries where there are thousands of years of tradition of that have produced very evolved forms of puppet theater, there's a different perspective. But I think what's true for puppet theater in the United States is very much true for theater in the United States. It's not. It's just as hard to talk about we don't have national theaters in every major city, for example. So naturally, we also don't have puppet theaters in every major city. So I think it's a conversation I've been having for a good 20 years now, the notion that somehow the grass is greener in Europe. It's not necessarily. And some of the most important work that's really influenced European puppet theater in the past couple of decades has in fact come from the United States.
Cheryl, what do you think that would be? When you say that, I'm very curious.
Oh, I don't want to name any names.
Okay.
I'd like to add, actually, in agreement with that, in Asia, I taught at the Hong Kong Academy for Performing Arts, and I brought a Chinese shadow puppet that I had made in puppet school, which is a very old form of puppetry, is Chinese shadow puppetry. It goes way back. None of my Chinese students had ever seen Chinese shadow puppetry. They didn't know what it was. And this is a performing arts school. They had no idea. They knew Peking opera very well, but they did not know anything about China. And I felt a little like coming to America and teaching kids about baseball, you know, because I was going to China to teach them about Chinese shadow puppets, and it was pretty interesting to me that we sort of assume because they do have a very long tradition that everybody knows it and that it's well supported. That is not necessarily true. There is the long tradition to draw from, but just as you said, sometimes it's not supported. There aren't state puppet theaters. There aren't, you know, especially in China, there was not that much of it. I was very surprised.
I would add to what the other point that you seem to be making about the association with children's theater and children. That's also an inherited notion from the European tradition, and of course there are reasons for it, but which are probably too vast to want to go into here. But it's the idea that we have a sense of a distinction between children's theater and what we call adult theater is, I mean, to my mind, it's a little bit erroneous. You know, I mean, yes, we have children that is more suitable for children because the themes are not too difficult and there's no sex, nudity, or violence. But it's still theater, and I think that I see it as personally as a very positive sign that something that we associated with a children's audience has now begun to make its way into the common theater vocabulary.
So let's jump back now. How do you start to be a puppeteer? Very simply. I know that we have people who have graduate degrees in puppetry on the panel. People may not even realize that you can get such degrees both here and abroad. But where does this start? Rick, where do you start?
Well, my story is very typical of many, many puppeteers of my generation. The first puppetry that I saw was on TV. Kukla, Fran and Ollie, Bert Hillstrom and his wonderful work was some of the first puppetry I ever saw on TV. And even other children's shows like Captain Kangaroo, like Mr. Moose was one of the first puppets I ever saw on TV. And it was something that, you know, immediately fascinated me. And your father's early work on the variety shows, you know, the Hollywood Palace and the Ed Sullivan Show, that's the first exposure that I had to puppetry. The first live puppet show I ever saw was a really bad Punch and Judy show at the 1964 World's Fair here. But despite the fact that it was not really great theater, it was still unbelievably exciting to me because it was live, and it was the first time I'd seen a puppet live, and that was like a life-changing event. I don't know, how do people, you know, where do proclivities for human existence come from? I don't know. It was something that always attracted me right away, and I think one of the reasons that it attracted me was because once I found out more about it and started studying, you know, well, who are these people? How do they do what they do? It encompasses an incredibly broad range of artistic disciplines. The average puppeteer is creating his own material and designing his puppets and creating his puppets and making it and painting the scenery and making his set, and ultimately gets to perform as well. And it's really good for someone who has attention deficit disorder. So I started my little pathetic efforts in puppetry very early on, and strictly a hobby. I was fairly late to coming to it professionally. I didn't really start professionally until I was 28.
And how did you make the switch from to becoming a professional puppeteer? Had you had specific training, or was it that you sort of trained yourself in your room?
I was pretty much self-taught, and I think a lot of puppeteers go through the same thing. I was just sort of by the skin of my teeth, whatever I could sort of gather from books and what I saw other people doing. The first time I ever met somebody else who called themselves a puppeteer was when I went to the O'Neill. Used to have a puppetry program there that was affiliated with the National Theater Institute, the Institute for Professional Puppetry Arts, which is a program that sadly no longer exists. But that was the first time I ever met somebody else who called themselves a puppeteer. Up until then, I was completely self-taught, and it was just really a hobby. And it really sort of just took me over. I think it chose me rather than me choosing it. It was something that I could just do 24/7 and never get tired of. And that's a story with a lot of puppeteers. And fortunately now, somebody who has interest in puppetry can go and get training. There are places that you can get that kind of training. like the Puppetry Conference at the O'Neill, at the University of Connecticut, at Janie's program out in
Cal Arts.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask Pam, because you are a graduate of the only degree-granting graduate program in puppetry in the United States.
I believe it's the only graduate degree.
Yeah, I think I
There is
said
undergraduate.
yes. There is a graduate degree program, and of course you do run this conference at the O'Neill Theater Center in Connecticut, which over the years, we should say, has always had a relationship to puppetry, which goes back to the fact that among the founders of the O'Neill were Rufus and Margot Rose, the creators of the Howdy Doody puppets, and I gather mentors to your father.
Friends.
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 So tell us about the program now and about the programs that there are.
When I went through the University of Connecticut, there was only 2 schools. The other one was UCLA, and they only took 2 puppeteers a year into that program. I was actually accepted into both, but decided to go to UConn because it was a much broader program. And UConn has continued. They're a wonderful program. They accept about 25, I believe it's up to. They have about 25 to 30 people going through both undergraduate and graduate levels. And there's multiple graduate degrees you can get from there as well. And it's a wonderful program. We study everything. We study directing, we study lighting, we study costume design, you study dance, you study acting, you study singing, you study everything. And that's what it takes to be a puppeteer very often. You are, as Rick said, one of the reasons we become puppeteers is because we like to do so many things. We all seem to be capable in a variety of areas to do them pretty well. Sometimes the jack of all trades, master of none comes to mind, but fortunately we're pretty good at all of those things. The O'Neill program grew out of the fact that on a sort of more professional level, there wasn't some place you could go and intensively study puppetry. And so one of our main goals is to develop new works for the puppet theater. That's one thing, to have actual wonderful shows coming out of here, and Roman has been one of our guest artists there, developing shows there for us. And we basically, the conference is it's one of my favorite experiences. We take about 25 to 30 participants, and within the context of a week, you will work with a guest artist, or you will be your own independent artist. And within about 5 days, you come out with a show that you're performing at the end of the week for the community and for the conference. And it's sort of an accelerated puppet program that you get to go to once a year. And like you said, you don't meet other puppeteers. Where do you go and find a group of puppeteers to learn your skill? There's nowhere to go, and the O'Neill provided this. There are puppet festivals with the Puppeteers of America as well, which are very good, but it's not intensive. And what the O'Neill does is we really try to give you tools to go out, and our dual goal is to develop puppet works and to raise the standards of puppetry, to make sure that good work is being developed and getting out there, and that people learn these skills. There's just no other avenue, and that's a joy of running the O'Neill, is that we're able to present that to very creative people.
I think that one of the things that is very special about puppetry is that people do come to it from so many different disciplines. And that in doing the Puppet Festival, we looked at hundreds of different puppet artists from all around the world. And some of the most exciting things is the differences. An artist like Janie Geiser or Theodora Skipetaris coming from art, from being flat artists or visual artists, people who are choreographers, Alice Farley, coming from the dance direction, coming from a text-based piece, that there are so many different directions that people can come from in order to be a puppeteer. Because I think that one of the wonderful things about puppetry is that it's not really easily defined, that it can be almost anything. And that's really exciting about it.
It's especially a meeting place of the visual arts and the performing arts, and I know that was one of the real incentives to me when I was first experimenting with puppet theater, was the discovery. I began as a theater person, but the discovery of the whole visual aspect of it was very important. And I think it's true that the whole performance art movement then particularly the 1980s, visual theater of the 70s, performance art of the 80s, has really given a huge push to puppet theater, and it's also made us start talking about puppet theater as something that's very, very much broader in scope than the notion of a theater in which little figures are, little humanoids, if you like, are simulating human beings. I think Basil shows an example of that, where shapes and forms have taken the place of characters.
Well, as you talk about shapes and forms, something Cheryl said reminded me actually of a piece I saw by your sister Heather, which was one of the earliest puppet pieces that I had seen, in which I watched it and I thought to myself, how is this different from dance? And even as I set up this probably fallacious relationship or oppositional relationship between human theater and puppet theater, I am struck that when I saw Basil's piece, it is like watching shapes dance. As I said, your sister's work very much had people doing what I would look at more as modern dance than puppetry. How do you develop the discipline? All of the disciplines that are worked at. Rick listed, that you're the performer, you're the writer, you build the puppets. How do you come to that, Basil? What was your experience?
Well, I started as a puppeteer very young. I mean, as a child, I was heavily influenced by Sesame Street, as so many of my generation were. And actually, it's also in my family. So my mother was a puppeteer when I was a kid. She had a sort of children's puppet company, and I just started making my own puppets, and it was mostly so it was the more the building thing that I liked. I was very shy as a child, so it was also a way for me to get attention, but without drawing too much attention to myself, which I think lots of puppeteers will tell you is the case. And then I came to New York and worked with a number of different artists, and eventually had this extraordinary experience where I had a training in France at this school in France, and at that school I was taught. Again, we covered it was like a spectrum of performance and building and music and dance and movement and voice and all the different puppetry techniques. So I had I think everybody has their different paths. I feel like I was really lucky that I found a training program, because I know that most puppeteers do just find their way. They're drawn to a certain puppeteer. I remember there was magnificent puppeteer named Bob Hartman in San Francisco, where I grew up, and I used to go see his shows all the time, and I know he taught me so much. And you're drawn to, you see people's work and you just go and try and learn more. Roman was also a teacher of mine, someone whose work I saw and I was curious about, and I think that's the way a lot of puppeteers work. They see work that interests them and they gravitate towards it. I was lucky enough to have a training program that supported that in addition to it. But it's really like people find their way. And I think that's why puppetry is so different, because everybody finds their own path to it.
Well, and to go back to what Roman was saying in conjunction to what you were just asking, what's the difference? What made Heather's piece a puppet piece rather than a dance piece? And I think it is, as Roman just briefly touched on, it's that in a piece of puppet theater, the visual thing, the physical thing that is the puppet is the focus. It's the central methodology for telling the story or presenting the piece, as opposed to it being an aspect of or just a little part of. Mm-hmm. It's the primary venue, it's the primary conduit for the performance, and that's, if you want to define puppet theater, that would be as close of a definition as that I can come to, is that the focus is not on a person or a dance or whatever. The focus is on that visual element that is the puppet, whether it's a rod puppet or a string puppet or a hand puppet or whatever it is. And that's sort of splitting hairs thing that we're talking about. That if a thing is a puppet theater piece, then the main focus of it is this object, which is a piece of craft, a sculptural object, whatever it is, that is the center of the device.
When we were producing the International Festival of Puppet Theater, this came up very often. Is it a puppet piece? Is it a theater piece? How much puppetry does it need to have in it to really make it a puppet theater piece? And one the question that we just kept coming back and asking ourselves is, does it need to be done with puppets? Can you do this piece with human actors just as well as with puppets? And if so, then just do it with human actors. It needs to have something special about the piece itself that is trying to convey, whether it's the story or the concepts, that the ideas are somehow beyond the everyday human world and everyday human interactions. And what is special about, why does it need to be puppets? And if you can't really say that, then you should just go ahead and do it with people.
Mm-hmm. Well, like Basil's piece is such a good example of that. It is so visual, and it's an abstraction. You can't deal with the human form. You can't deal with those same kind of abstract ideas and those abstract movements and so forth that you can deal with, in a piece like Basil's. A person waving his arms around in a tank of water would look pretty silly. But
there might be an audience for it, but it's that different experience entirely.
In fact, there's that club downtown that no. So the key for me is like that visual thing. It's that abstraction. It's that reduction. A puppet is, by its very nature, an abstraction, a reduction, a
concept, an idea.
Something that's boiled down to its very essential nature. When a human being walks out on stage, even given the willing suspension of disbelief that is at the heart of all theater, when a human being walks out on stage, intellectually, I know that, this guy's name is not Bob, it's Frank, and he lives at home, and he has to commute in every day, and he brushes his teeth. There's so much information that I know about this human being. When a puppet walks out on stage, it is what it is. It's not pretending to be something else. It is what it is. And so it's an abstraction, a reduction. And there are things that you can do with puppets because of that you just can't do with humans. They have too much baggage.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that, what I'd heard was that if you think of it, a puppet is to an actor the way a poem is to an essay. I mean, basically, it's like a piece of poetry. It's just taken a few lines of all this information and made it into one visual piece for you.
Well, Roman, you direct what would be seen as conventional human theater. You create works which are specifically puppet theater, to this issue of making the choice, because you've done, if I read your biography correctly, you have done work with puppets from what are considered conventional works of dramatic literature. How do you make those choices?
Well, I'm not so much sure that's really a choice. I mean, to me, the puppet is a very, very seductive theatrical medium, and it's in the same way that a visual artist chooses to work with collage or watercolor. I have primarily chosen to work with puppetry, and the pieces that I have directed that are from the dramatic canon or whatever have been pieces that, in most cases, I myself have chosen because I saw a certain potential for my own particular way or my own particular theatrical vision, my way of doing things, which normally does include some, if not puppets per se, what I call puppet technique, which is a pretty broad, way of describing it. But I would agree, however, that with what Rick was saying earlier, that when we end up labeling something puppet theater, it's because the puppet becomes the focus, the dramatic focus of the piece. And to come back to something that he was saying at the very beginning about revealing the puppeteer, I think that's very critical to understanding what's going on in contemporary puppetry, because while traditionally the puppeteer is discreet, invisible, in the interest of creating a total illusion, puppeteers emerging from the wings has changed it's changed the perception of what puppet theater is. Now, he was describing a situation in which the actor and the puppet are basically doubling doubling for one another in terms of attempting to present a single character. What we did in Dead Puppet Talk, the piece from which the Bill Irwin segment is taken, was in fact to try to allow the puppeteers to be characters in their own right, and the puppets, so that while they were manipulating the puppets, at the same time we were trying to push the audience to actually credit the puppet with its own life, if you like, with its own character, and to see to what extent that's possible. And I think that for me, in any case, that's the essence of puppet theater, but without removing the human being from his direct interaction with it, at which point it becomes animation. I didn't really answer your question today about
But what you say is fascinating. I want to pick up on what you said. You commented about, we talk about what's going on in contemporary puppetry. What is going on in contemporary puppetry? What are the things that people are looking to explore? Are there endless new techniques that we continue to find? Are there trends that you all want to deal with? Cheryl, you've got such an overview. I'm wondering, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you see, or if I put you too much on the spot.
Well, I could talk a little bit about our puppet festivals, that we did do these large-scale puppet festivals here in New York throughout the 90s. And we started in 1992, and we did 5 festivals every other year until the year 2000. And we presented, I think at last count, it was 136 different productions over those 5 festivals, and so it was a very broad range. And our focus really was on contemporary adult puppet theater. We always had a component for children, because nobody wants to leave the kids out, and there is some wonderful, wonderful work out there for children, but we wanted to focus the attention on the work for adults, and to really introduce the New York audience to what adult puppetry could be. We had seen so many shows. When I say we, actually, I've seen, my father and I and many of us would go to festivals throughout the world, and we actually first thought of the idea of doing this particular festival up at a Puppeteers of America festival at MIT when I first met Roman. And we're seeing an extraordinary piece by a German puppeteer. It was a piece called Hermann. It was a very, very simple piece where this very simple wooden puppet completely came to life. So throughout the 90s, we were trying to introduce people to a very broad range. And within each festival, we try to have something that incorporates that is coming from dance, something that is coming from visual arts, something that incorporates video, something to really keep the definition of puppetry as broad as possible. And yet to always have a strong component of puppetry within each piece. Now, I think that a lot of the younger artists who are now working in puppetry have picked up that broadness, and that they do see that the palette is all theirs. They can work with anything, that there aren't these strict limitations of what puppetry must be. It can be almost anything. And I have to say that some of the most exciting young new artists that I see working are working at the Dream Music puppetry program at here, which is Basil's program. And there's a wonderful community of artists there. But what you see is that you see them working on each other's shows, but incorporating many different techniques, incorporating video, incorporating music, live singing, and that anything goes. And that, to me, is what's most exciting.
Well, clearly, Basil, you need to tell us more about that program.
Well, that was a program initially just Symphonie Fantastique premiered down at the Here Art Center in Soho in 1998 and inaugurated a new space that was kind of perfectly configured for puppetry, a very intimate space. And it was really just a program to keep the ball rolling there, to keep that space alive and active. And to, I had the experience when I had the success of Symphonie Fantastique that I had puppeteers coming towards me, as I had gravitated towards puppeteers whose work interested me. And it was and most of them had small pieces that they were developing on their own. And so it was just an opportunity, this program, to give these puppeteers resources and a venue and an opportunity to show their work. And so we produce maybe just 3 or 4 shows a year. that are puppeteers who I would call emerging artists. So artists who have not had the opportunity to present a full-fledged show and have maybe never worked with theatrical lights or a sound system, but we have that available at the theater downtown.
And Pam, when you gather, again, a lot of young, and you also use the phrase emerging artists at the O'Neill, are there trends, are there things that these younger puppeteers come up there wanting to explore, wanting to learn, wanting to...
Well, it's interesting because it almost is going back. Right now there's a huge interest in marionettes again. And for a few years, as far as when we were getting out of graduate school, marionettes were sort of very old-fashioned and not interesting. But they have blossomed again. We have a huge interest in marionettes. So certain techniques are interesting, but it also is exploding everywhere because we are also including now sort of a video arena, a film arena, because the whole technique of puppets on film has completely opened up as well. And so it's almost as though the trend is everything. I mean, everything is being used and brought into the puppet world, the puppet field. Everything that could be a puppet, every technique from video to theater specialties are brought in. It's very exciting to see because my emerging artists who come to us, emerging artists in our venue present us with an idea. They're puppeteers, like you said, who've maybe never worked with real lights before or had any support. And what we do at the O'Neill in that week, we support the artists. We give them puppeteers to work for them. We give them help in building these things and techniques of getting it built. There's a staff available to them to say, why don't you try it this way? This is how it worked previously. Oh, that's a great idea. Let's go in that avenue will help you out more. But the variety of what comes to us is so broad, from children's theater all the way through very serious works of art. It's a very exciting time in puppetry. I think we are just opening up and being accepted. I think for many years, the puppet field, we weren't necessarily all that well accepted into theater venues, so we were sort of shunted aside. And now it's wonderful. I feel as though we have so much respect going.
You mentioned film and video, and I want to mention two things that came up in a discussion I had before the seminar with one of our staff. You comment about the upswing in marionettes again, and I can't help but wonder, triggered by this conversation, whether the fact that so many people saw the film Being John Malkovich, which opened with extraordinary marionette work by Philip Huber, and in the same way that apparently there are people rushing to forensic science programs because of CSI, does that, is that a factor when a certain type of puppetry is elevated, just as now we've got, how many thousands of people a week seeing Avenue Q live? Does that affect it? But at the same time, in the same conversation, it was pointed out that now, almost 30 years ago, we had this extraordinary character created on film, Yoda, by Frank Oz. And Yoda is now computer animated. So it's the push and pull of an ancient art form that comes up against the modernism. And how much is an opportunity and how much is it something that has to be fought against?
Well, I think every time that a major feature film featuring puppets has success, there's an impact, and it's good for puppet theater in general. But I think one of the reasons for the explosion of experimentation in puppet theater has a lot to do with the fact that in the late 70s, 80s, the contact with performance art, if you like, and the definition, or the redefinition of puppet theater as anything can be a puppet, which people keep saying here, has made it possible for younger or emerging artists to say, okay, I want to work with puppets, but they think about the show before they think about the technique. And in other words, they're able, they now have the blessing, as it were, of the critical blessing with which to say, okay, a popsicle stick is okay. It doesn't have to have 15 strings. And that's created a very liberating environment for puppet theater. And I think that what's happened personally after a certain number of years of people experimenting with what was often referred to as theater of objects is the rediscovery of the desire to further articulate the object. So in a sense, we're rediscovering the technique and maybe reinventing it. Each puppeteer, as someone mentioned earlier, is kind of reinventing it in his own way, and that explains the variety, the huge variety of shows that one can see that are, under the rubric puppet theater.
Basil, technology, obviously, I mean, it's underwater technology, plays into how you achieve some of Symphonie Fantastique. I mean, are people actually on tanks at times when they're or they're just in wetsuits?
No, people are just in wetsuits backstage. They don't get in the tank. But the thing about my show, which is interesting, is that I am a bit of an old-fashioned puppeteer, in that I always, in my shows, I keep the puppeteers hidden. I'm sort of have in fact reacted to the sort of new wave of modern puppetry where the puppeteer is always visible, because I really loved the total illusion. So in my show, it's very much, in Symphonie Fantastique, it's very much a little curtain that goes up on a small proscenium, and the imagery happens within that proscenium, and you don't see the puppeteers at work. The thing is, though, the imagery is, some people have compared it, it's very much like a computer image, and it's square like a video monitor, and looks like maybe your computer screensaver or something, and that's part of, though, what's so...
They don't put that in the ads.
They don't put that in the ads, no, but the thing is that you know that it's live. It's not a film when you're watching it. You know that it's live. You don't need to see the puppeteers actually in action to... And in fact, our show is very much a low-tech show. I mean, there's a lot of lights, but it's really just some stuff on sticks, and we're moving it through water. It's very low-tech, but it has this... it looks something like computer imagery, and I think it's just interesting that you mentioned computer imagery, because people make that comparison with the show a lot, except for, and people have also asked me all the time, why don't you make a video of this show? Well, it's not, because it's not a video. It's a live experience, and it's too close to a film in a way. And what really puts it in a different place is that there is a live element to it. You can feel the puppeteers at work back there, even though you can't see them.
And in fact, I mean, we talked earlier about the presence of the puppeteer and where the focus is, while through the entire experience you are watching, through a very formal proscenium, this show taking place in a 1,000-gallon tank. At the end of the show, it wasn't announced, but the curtain was opened and the audience was invited to peek behind the curtain and get a sense, and in fact the puppeteers were explaining a bit of how they did some of what they did. Is that because you want people to know more, to understand what they've seen? Is it just to give them more of an experience in the theater that night?
I just, a lot of people want to see that. I don't want them to see it, personally, I don't want them to see it during the show, not during that show. That's not my intention. I want them to focus on what I'm trying to show them. But I'm not trying to hide my secrets, ultimately, and people are fascinated by that.
And in fact, you're selling seats backstage?
Yes,
I saw
we actually are.
So people who've seen it can then go back and watch how it was done.
Actually see how the show is happening live. Besides, also, people do get to see the show backstage after the show. But we also offer an opportunity for people to watch backstage. It is a complete experience. I know that people love that and enjoy that, and that's part of what... that's part of puppetry today, that a lot of people want to know how it's done. There's definitely also people in the audience who come and see the show and they say, I don't want to go backstage. I don't want to know how it was done. I want to leave it as it is. And I love it when people say that.
Well, and that tradition of watching how something is done in performance is not new either. I mean, I'm going to mispronounce it because I always do, the Karagios thing, the Turkish shadow puppets. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, they are performed with anybody sitting wherever they want to. They can sit behind and watch the puppeteer perform it if they want to see behind the scenes, and they can sit in front and just watch the screen if they want to. So that's not a new thing. It's very interesting. This idea of revealing, or whatever, is is so interesting because there's an interesting irony about it. A lot of people go to see something backstage or they see a technique revealed, and it's even more of a mystery once it's been explained or once they've seen it. I loved your father on one of the episodes of the Jim Henson Hour said, okay, we're just going to pull back and we're going to see all the puppeteers. And there's an interesting thing about, it's why like DVD extras are packed with making ofs, because people love to get that stuff. They'd like to see how something is accomplished. But explaining it and showing it doesn't necessarily take the mystery away. Sometimes it adds to the mystery. Sometimes you just go, that's all it is? How do they make it seem so real? So that's an interesting thing. And I also just want to respond really quickly to your notion of technology and how that affects theater, because of course it always does. And whatever current theater technology is available always finds its way into commercial and experimental theater. I mean, can you imagine like when electrical lights first became available to theaters? Wow, what a special effect. But there are definitely things that happen because of technology too. We are such a technology-saturated culture right now. I think one of the reasons that there's been a surge in puppetry is because theater puppetry is real. It's happening in real time, right in front of you, and because it's puppets, it's dimensional, it's very visceral. And I think people are a little oversaturated with, DVDs and TV and computer animation and blah, 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 blah. I think people do reach a point where they get tired of that, and something simpler seems innovative.
And seeing the puppeteer at work on stage brings that home even more, that you see that act happening right there in front of you. You see how it's being done, and still you can get lost in it.
Or even feeling it, as Basil said earlier, even if the puppeteer is invisible, because it's, when you asked earlier about the difference between the actor and the puppet, normally speaking, a puppet can achieve in about 5 hours of work what an actor can achieve in about 5 seconds. So what that means is that the art of it is in that struggle to achieve that same kind of, if it's a naturalistic gesture, that fluidity and naturalness or the beauty of the moment. And it's not it's a difficult art form, and I think that for an audience, it's the feeling, whether they're conscious of it or not, of the struggle to produce what the puppet is producing, the visual effect or whatever is the real core of the art form.
Right. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, maybe not even the struggle, but the play of it.
The tension.
Because my father was always into the playfulness of it, and that it's the fastness and it's the human aspect of it, and in particular the hand. That a good puppet performance almost always comes back down to the performance of the human aspect of it, and very often in the hands. And what is the hand able to express and and put into the puppet to be able to create a sense of life. And there's my brother's working a lot now with creating computer-generated characters that are totally still performed by puppeteers and puppeteers' hands, and it's very hands-on, so that you get the high technology, but that good performance needs the naturalness and the easiness and the playfulness of the human hands.
I was going to
it's
say,
human effort.
Yeah, when you address the technology advancement problem, I don't see it as a problem. It's just more tools for puppeteers to use. We are nothing if we are not pragmatic, and we will take whatever the technology is and we will figure out how to create and tell our stories. Yeah. That's what we do as puppeteers. We love, a lot of times we're gadget geeks, we like how little things work, and how did that car move across the floor? Well, we'll incorporate that into something else, and then we'll also draw it into learning to make that movement fluid and learning to make it really look like the animal we need it to be.
And puppeteers are real experimenters. The whole thing of whatever you have, make that work. And so if there's some cool new technology, you can bet that there are going to be some puppeteers that are come forward and make it work for them. Because it's really about doing it differently, doing it in a way that it hasn't been done before, and taking what's available.
Yeah, all artists are early adapters, or adopters. They just take in whatever's available and use it, whether it's a rubber band or a computer animation or whatever. And I do want to just qualify what I said. I was responding directly to your thing about technology. There is definitely pendulum that swings away from it, but it's also very embraced. And I mean, let's just look at contemporary theater in general. If you look at very sort of traditional Broadway musicals now, they're all using video, and they're all using projections, and they're all using, what's the word I'm looking for? Musical programs that have scores synthesized and what is the word I'm looking for? It's actually not just a synthesizer, but it actually plays the thing.
These virtual orchestras
and all the technology that's involved in scenic stuff now. It's all like computerized. There's not a stagehand pushing something on stage. It's all on computerized tracks and all this sort of stuff. So definitely art adopts technology and exploits it for all it's worth as soon as it's available.
Well, I want to do an incredibly unsubtle segue. Both Basil and Rick have brought a couple of puppets with them, and so I'm going to ask them to kind of bring them out, because it's in response to something that Cheryl was saying about that it all comes back down to the hand. And when Avenue Q was being developed, there were people I know who saw the show and said, well, it's really cute, but how do you put it in a theater? I mean, the thing's still this big. And it does come back to what we keep saying, that is that it's fundamentally human. With Avenue Q, the show has gone to larger and larger venues. The same has happened with Symphonie Fantastique, where the scale of what goes on. So does that become a fundamental limitation of working with many kinds of puppets? That's not to say there aren't people who have created enormous puppets. We look at what Julie Taymor has done in Lion King. We look even at the Halloween parade here in New York, which really had its roots as a puppet event. But how does scale affect what you do or limit what you do?
Well, certainly there are limitations inherent in any particular form of puppet in terms of scale. You can, in theory, make a marionette that is 18 feet tall, but the sheer weight of it and the physical exertion that it's going to take to move it is going to be rather extraordinary too. So when you scale up a puppet, the amount of exertion and force required to perform it is going to exponentially increase as well. With Avenue Q, the puppets that we use, and I have a couple here from the show, are very much in the tradition of hand puppets. They're what we call mouth puppets. The puppeteer's hand is, in this instance, the puppeteer's hand is in the head operating the mouth, and there's another hand on, this is what we call a life hands puppet, and then the puppeteer's other hand is in the hand. And this is normally, I should point out, this kind of puppet is normally performed by two puppeteers. There's normally a person in the right hand as well. So again, he's bigger, requires two people. It's beyond the scope of one person to perform. But one of the things that I said earlier about puppetry is, it's going back to the idea of abstractions. In playing in a big space, Nikki's eye, this is Nikki from Avenue Q, Nikki's eye is the size of the bottom third of an actor's whole face. Yeah. So when we first moved Avenue Q from off-Broadway to Broadway, that was a big consideration. Will it play in a bigger house? And we literally took the puppets to different theaters and said, can you see it from the back row? And the truth is, you can see Nikki's face from the back row in a big theater better than you can see one of the humans' faces. Because it's abstracted and because the color is bright and all those things, because it's a reduction, it's a simplification. I like to think of this kind of puppet, my sort of design aesthetic is like, what would Al Hirschfeld do? You know, what's the least information that I can provide that makes the appropriate impression on the audience? You know, his pictures were famous for being so spare. He could take a line like that and, oh my gosh, it's Bernadette Peters, you know, with almost no information. And that's what we're trying to do when we just, design this kind of puppet, is what's the least amount of information we can do. But obviously, this kind of puppet is limited by how big the puppeteer can be. I mean, this is about as big a puppet in this style as you can use and still have a human being exert it and still have proportions that seem reasonable. Yes, we could scale up the puppets. We could make their heads a lot bigger to fill a 4,000 seat roadhouse somewhere. But it probably wouldn't work very well because there's something about the relative scale of them that works. We have taken the puppets to like award shows and stuff, And yes, they're swallowed up by a barn the size of Radio City Music Hall. But we've done award shows in 2,000-seat houses with our producers sitting in the back row going, I can see them so well. Why aren't we in a bigger theater? So, yes, there are definitely limitations to this style of puppet. You can only make them as big as a human being can perform them. After they get too big, they get too...
in relationship to actors, so it makes sense that they be...
You don't want the puppet to overwhelm the actor either. In this case, in the case of Avenue Q. Now, of course, you talk about Julie Taymor's work and like the Magic Flute. Have you seen her production of the Magic Flute? She's got these huge, like 18-foot tall pole puppets. But they're manipulated by 4 or 5 people. And the ones that are not are like, what we sometimes refer to as kite puppets. They're made out of like ripstop nylon, and they're basically 2-dimensional on frames. And they are performed by like 1 or 2 people because they're so light. But they have limitations to what they can do because they're so big. So every style of puppet, every choice that you make about what kind of puppet you use definitely has scale issues that it has to deal with.
Well, I just want to say something about the style of the puppets because, of Avenue Q puppets, because they're based on the Muppet style. And if you go back to when my father first created the Muppet style back in the 50s, he created them for television. And it was actually the first time that puppets had ever been designed specifically to be performed on television. Before that, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, or Bill Baird's puppets, Howdy Doody, were puppets for the live theater that then made it onto television. So here he was creating a new style of puppets just for television, and that's why they were so simple. And it was back in the 50s when television was all black and white. In fact, the anchors would wear dark lipstick and because to accentuate their mouths so you could really see them speaking. And so he was actually the first person to do lip sync. Before that, when a puppet would talk, it would just go all over the place, like the alligator in Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. But the Muppets were the first ones that would actually do it right to the words. And that was about the television. So now it's really interesting to see that now gravitate back to the live theater. So I think it's sort of an interesting...
Another thing about scale, so the puppet that I brought is smaller, and just to say that as we were saying, a lot of puppeteers start out because they want to be their own performer, their own stagehand, their own hair and makeup person, their own playwright and builder. And it's sort of the idea of, I know I used to do shows like these, and I still sometimes perform by myself. And it's nice to be able to perform by yourself. It's the thing of a puppeteer being able to control their own universe and present it, and having it be miniature makes that possible. So that's part of why so much of a lot of puppetry we see is miniature. And I also there's a great appeal to the miniature and to the intimate experience. There was a show we just presented down at the Dream Music Puppetry program that was for only 25 people at a time, and it's a very special theatrical experience to have that, to be in such a small space with a small number of people focused on such a small thing. It's very different. It requires a very different kind of concentration than being in an enormous house. Anyway, that's just
Can we see the puppet that you brought? Because I need to say, just to share with everyone while you're getting it, we had Paula Vogel with us a couple of weeks ago and mentioned that you were going to be doing it. And she immediately said, he must bring, and I'm not going to remember the name right, so you'll tell us the name of the puppet, but the idea that she had seen a particular puppet that Basil did and said, you must see this. Now, there is a huge world of puppetry. Very casually, there have been a lot of mentions of different kinds of puppets. We're only representing 2 here. But
this is obviously a very different kind of puppet. This is a string puppet. He's called Stickman, is his name, and he's a very a basic string marionette. Marionettes are it's wonderful that there is more of an interest in marionettes right now. It's a really difficult technique. It's actually a little tricky doing it on this chair here. And it's wonderful to know that there are so many people who are interested in technique, because there was a lot of puppetry for a while with popsicle sticks, and not that that doesn't take enormous technique itself, but this is a technique that takes a long time to learn, and it's a old tradition, the string puppets. And one of the best things, of course, a string puppet can do is fly. And a beautiful thing about a string puppet is that it's separate from my hands. I mean, my hands are obviously working, but I can have an experience with this puppet where I can really sit and watch him, like from a distance, because I have a distance from him. I don't have my hand right in him. And so in a way I can do I have even more opportunities to perform with this puppet. I can relate to him and use him in ways where I'm actually in relationship to the puppet, and that the relationship between the puppeteer and the puppet, there's that metaphor of someone bringing something to life. You can see that actually happening.
God.
Exactly.
And it also bespeaks why you use a puppet, because puppets can fly. Making a human being do this would take hours in a theater, and lots of money, and lots of flying rigs.
Right.
But to get the visual, then you make the choice to use the puppet.
And talk about what we were saying before about the physical, the human effort involved. Now, if we took that puppet away and we showed you Basil's hands just going like this, it probably wouldn't. I mean, it might be interesting, but it wouldn't add up to a whole lot. And what I was just doing with Nikki is this. It's very subtle.
Well, Pam, haven't you worked on a children's show?
Yeah, we have a show called Obie, which is just eyeballs on the top of the hand. It's the bare hand talking to you with just eyeballs looking at you. And actually, children love it. They sit at home and do this themselves, apparently. They talk to their own hands, which is great, the start of puppeteers. But that's what it is.
That's one of the, we touched on it earlier, one of the great things about, why do puppets appeal to children? Why does that happen? Why is it not just a thing for adults? I think it goes back to that abstraction, that reduction, that simplification. Children glom onto symbols and abstractions like we just don't comprehend. So when this thing that we've created, full of abstractions, reductions, and everything, is presented from a kid, they frequently grab onto and recognize it from a visceral point of view that we just don't know. And so I think it's easy to see why kids are attracted to puppetry. It's for all the same reasons that we are, without all the intellectual BS that goes with it.
Yeah, actually, I have a 2.5-year-old daughter who is an active puppeteer, and I think that most little 2.5-year-olds are, because there's something about just picking things up and giving them characters, giving them voices, that is so human. And it's a little bit about controlling your environment. It's a little bit about getting the play that's going on inside your head out for somebody to share, to have an interaction with somebody else, to have an imaginary friend. But it is so natural and it's so immediate. So when you're first asking, how do people come to puppetry? What an odd road to follow. It's more like, how do they come back to it? Because so many kids have it.
Right. Well, it's kind of, at that level, for a kid to be performing, it's an empowerment. I mean, it gets all into that, exactly, it's control. And it's sort of like, as you start to intellectualize these things as you get older and you talk about, adult theater and stuff like that, you wrap up on all these mind games about, well, it's Frankenstein and you're creating life from the lifeless, blah, blah, blah. But it happens at a much more sort of elemental and essential place than that.
And she was putting her hand inside of puppets and insisting on performing them from when she was like 1. And so it's a very natural thing. She doesn't pretend that it's alive. It's like the difference, she knows the difference between when it's being puppeteered and is it alive. It's totally part of human nature to understand that and still want to do it and be a part of it.
That suspension of disbelief that is just natural to children. They just believe everything, whereas we
But they also want to do it to self,
Well, and it's, I've also used the phrase willing suspension of disbelief, but it was in about a year ago, I think, the Village Voice, this interview that you participated in, and what I loved about the way you said it was, it's not really the willing suspension of disbelief, it's the creation of belief. Or the continuation of believe?
It's just believing, being able to look at something, and it's actually something that Paula Vogel said. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that show, but she just pointed out, it's not the suspension of disbelief, it's that you're looking at that and you're believing in it.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. And even though I can see it's on your hand, and I can see that, and how amazing that is. And I was really lucky to work with Paula on this show, The Long Christmas Ride Home, which had puppeteers visible, and but there was a really interesting sort of setup in that show, and I think it also speaks to why puppetry is popular nowadays, or a lot of use in puppetry in a larger theater piece, is the idea of, as we started to point out, to puppetry as a metaphor. And in Long Christmas Ride Home, there were actors who used puppets that looked like their childhood selves. And the actor, puppeteer character stood behind the puppet, and simultaneously as they were animating the puppet and bringing it to life, there was an act of them witnessing their own childhood, retelling the story of their childhood. They were being storytellers of their own past. They were also witnesses to it, someone who was just observing what was happening. And I think there's lots of uses that we're seeing. For example, in The Lion King, my interpretation of a lot of the magic of The Lion King is the joy of seeing not just the story being told, but seeing people telling a story being told. It's not just the story of a lion, it's the story of people. There's people who are telling the story of this lion, and they have these fantastic costumes and these things that they use to tell this story, and it's a theatrical event. The storytelling itself becomes, I think it's being used a lot.
And it is totally a theatrical convention. If you took the Lion King production on Broadway and put it on video, it would not be as compelling and it would not be as interesting. You'd rather watch the cartoon. And it's the same way with Avenue Q. Avenue Q is not a television show. The conceit is so theatrical, having the puppeteer and the puppet on stage at the same time. It's so theatrical that you really cannot take it out of its theatrical context very successfully.
Although it looked great on the Tonys.
Yeah, it did look
Really
good
good.
on the time.
I want to come back to Long Christmas Ride Home, because that is a play where in production, obviously, there is the choice that the childhood selves were puppets manipulated by the actors, who then, when it flashed forward to what were actually more present-day scenes, the puppets were gone and those people played. Had Paula conceived that immediately, or was that a directorial concept? Where did that choice come from? And then I have a second question.
Just a third part of that show was that they ultimately, then the puppets were brought back to them.
Right.
And I think that was, in my sense of the show, that's really what almost the entire show was about, was this moment when the puppeteers start with their childhood selves, then they play their adult selves, and then the puppets are brought back to their arms. And I feel like that was the moment that Paula was really creating mostly the play around, was when the puppets were brought back, when those characters went back to their childhood selves once we'd gone through their entire journey. And that was Paula's choice. That was the playwright's choice. She had been fascinated by puppetry for a while, and also by Japanese theater forms, and Japan has a venerable puppetry tradition that is really, it's almost its highest theater tradition in Japan, and so she felt that was appropriate. There were Japanese themes in the show, and it was an appropriate technique for that piece.
And of course, because you were working with actors who were not necessarily puppeteers.
No, that's right.
And I'm curious to ask both you and Roman, because Roman, as you say, you make choices, you don't look at the definitions, you may do pieces where you incorporate puppets, they may be solely puppet. Obviously, we've just been listening to people who've spent lives immersed in puppetry, and then what happens when you get to the situation? Do you find you have to make a choice of, I need an actor, I need a puppeteer? Rick is obviously achieving both. Is that common, or do you find yourself training people for one or the other? Roman, I'll put you on the spot first.
Well, I think, the choice is dictated by the necessity within the production. And yes, if you decide, you're talking about character-driven pieces. And so if you say, well, the character is, in my mind, best represented by a puppet, or a puppet cum puppeteer, or a puppet cum actor, or, whatever, or just an actor. I think it's, the choice should be dictated by the production itself. And yes, it's often the case that I've often worked with actors who had no prior puppetry experience. And I've consequently adjusted my sights in terms of the level of technical proficiency that I expected them to have in terms of accomplishing something that would still be finished and perfect for an audience, and not just look like a simulation of something that could be better done if a trained puppeteer stepped into the role. And it's interesting to work with actors who, there is a mindset that an actor has to have. There's certain kind of open-mindedness, I guess, to the idea of expressing something through an object or thing outside of themselves. There is always that element of detachment that Basil was talking about when he was doing the Stickman. And so you see you're doing it, and you see it at the same time. And one of the more difficult things to achieve also with I would say most actors, I'm generalizing of course, but is to get them to a point where they understand that they don't have to do it all, that they don't have to express express facially, for example, every sentiment that's being communicated, because the figure is there as well. So, and to find the balance between what they're giving to the puppet figure and what they're doing themselves. Otherwise, the result, which is tragic, is that you see an actor acting but holding a thing in his hands, and that's what you're trying to achieve is what we've talked about earlier, is transferring the focus from the performer himself to the figure. And in my experience, if the actor can do it, the audience will follow him there. That if he can successfully develop the necessary psychology or whatever to transfer his performance to the object, the audience will similarly focus on the object or the puppet.
Basil?
That's just when, like for Long Christmas Ride Home, it was key to make puppets that were simple for people to work so that they weren't bogged down by the technique. And once the basics of the technique, it is best to have something where people can use their hand, because we're so used to that as children, maybe moving things with our hands and bringing things to life as we tell stories. So I tried to make a puppet that was stripped of as much technical difficulty as possible, and then just trying to coax that out of the actors to believe in what they were doing. The moments when you could see moments when they were watching their own puppet and they kind of fell for it. They fell for the thing that they were doing, and I would encourage them whenever I saw that. And I feel that almost anybody has that capacity. Some people are blocked because they can't put something in their hands. They're maybe so present in their bodies. Some actors or dancers. I find that I've worked with musicians a lot who are good because they're used to transmitting things through their hands. Right. But that being said, still, there's nothing like a good puppeteer. A good puppeteer really has skills in those shortcuts and a real facility for entering into that puppet mindset immediately.
There are certain people who just get it, and when you work with a puppeteer, it just gets what it's about, because it's a lot about, as a working puppeteer, it's about sublimating yourself and your ego and what's going on with you and putting all of that into the character of the puppet. And some actors who have trained a very long time to have the right body and the right look and the right movement in their faces losing all that training is almost impossible, and they just can't make that transition into, this is my puppet, this is who I am, this doesn't exist, this is what I'm talking about. Very hard for some people to do.
Oh yeah, it's very tricky. Well, but it also it goes down to people's personal proclivities and what they can do. It's not all that different from casting any other show, because in every show there will be something that the actor has not encountered before. You know, oh, you're going to be walking on stilts while you're singing this opera. Oh, okay, I'm not comfortable with that, but I'll try. Or you're going to be performing this, and your makeup is going to be bright red with spots. You know, so it's like that leap of faith sort of always exists. But yes, it is difficult to cast an actor without previous puppet experience to perform with puppets frequently. The ones that seem to do best are the ones who have are very in touch with their physical selves. People like Bill Irwin, people who have physical training, and that's part of what they are. Dancers are frequently very good puppeteers. As you said, musicians, there's a lot of comparisons between performing with a puppet and playing an instrument. And going outside of yourself and letting that other thing do its expressing for you.
We're really down to our last few moments. I want to ask Cheryl, again, given your overview, where are the places, can you just tell people, our viewers, where to look for puppetry, where to find it? Here in New York, what are the centers to go to? We've heard about here and Basil's program there. Are there particular places that people can look for the information?
It's still a little spotty. La Mama just had a wonderful puppetry series where they had 8 performances that were extraordinary at La Mama. Here just did 3. You can always check our website at hensonfoundation.org, and we have a Puppet Happenings listing there that does try to have a good listing of what's happening in puppetry. But there is not one puppet theater that you can go to all the time. But hopefully more and more theaters will include puppetry.
But there are resources out there, and people can look for it. They can, for information on the O'Neill's program, website, they can go there. Here, I assume, has web information. Here.org, all very easy. And Rick, your own work at lyonpuppets.com. Mm-hmm. So there are all of those opportunities. Roman, anywhere that we can look to track what you're up to next? Okay. Well, we will get there. I have obviously revealed the biases and the limitations of coming to puppetry late in my life. But as I said at the beginning, it is really remarkable what you all achieve, what you support, and the horizons that are opened up by this form, which even in talking today, it's pretty clear we shouldn't try to define it as any one thing and just incorporate it into our concept of performance, of theater, of art, of creativity. And I thank you all very much for opening these avenues up to us through this discussion and in all you do. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.